Good morning. It is a special time of the year for our communities and our culture. And for us as a congregation, we have several events. One this afternoon that I want to mention is a 1 o'clock at Wesley House for cocoa, cookies, and carols. So if you're interested in helping spread the good news and the cheer among those over at Wesley House and among ourselves, as we're already doing this morning, please join us over there at 1 o'clock. The opportunity for us to continue asking questions, which we've been doing for the last 2 weeks. It's supposed to start by itself. Let's see, there it is. Maybe it'll keep going. No. Okay. Guess I'm going to have to keep pushing buttons. A review of some of the things we've looked at recently. You may recall, if you weren't with us, this is what we've covered. From Luke chapter 1, the story of Zacharias and Elizabeth, and that the question that Zacharias asked as he was being informed that they would be parents in their old age for the herald of the coming Messiah, John the Baptizer, as he's commonly known, who was a relative of some sorts to Jesus, 6 months in advance, and he was crying in the wilderness, prepare for the day of the Lord is at hand. Then last week we looked at, from Luke chapter 1, a few verses following that story of Zacharias, at the announcement to Mary and how she handled it. And her question was, how shall this be? And what a difference there is in asking for the certainty for God to somehow verify His message through Gabriel that Zacharias asked. And the question that Mary asked was, how is this going to happen? How shall this be? And so the evidence of God's willingness to work in their behalf for the sake of all mankind was made clear in those two lessons. This morning we want to shift gears to the book of Matthew. And in Matthew chapter 1, the first 12 verses we'll be looking at together in just a moment. But herein is going to be a question that raises, I hope, the anticipated answer on our part of where is He? Now that this Messiah has arrived, coming from afar, we commonly refer to them as the wise men. We're not sure if they were astrologers or court magicians. Wherever they fit into their culture, they were men who were prepared by looking for. I think it's very interesting how this story turns out, this episode of the story turns out, in that the Gentile world came looking for the Messiah that the Jews had been told about and even knew the Scriptures where He would be born. And yet it's the Gentiles who come looking for Him. I think that fact of their culture spiritually bears out in the life of Jesus, including His crucifixion. And I believe that is part of what Paul mentioned to the Galatians about the fullness of time. At the right moment, God sent forth His Son in order to accomplish God's will. Jesus said over and over, they do not take my life, I lay it down on your behalf. So the evidence of Matthew chapter 2 and how the wise men and others play into this storyline is very pertinent when we ask the questions for ourselves. Where is He? In today's world, and in our life, and in our schedule, and in our routines, where is the Messiah? Read with me from Matthew chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is He who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw His star when it rose, and have come to worship Him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." And then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word so that I too may come and worship him." And after listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. The opportunities for us to dwell during this time of the year especially, but truly year-round, on what was taking place here by God's providence among the people of Israel, but in fact and indeed throughout the world. The coming from afar brings us to an awareness by the question that was asked: where is the one who was born King of the Jews? This is an interesting question when it came to Herod's ears, because Herod had been called King of the Jews in the city of Rome by his peers for over 40 years in the fullness of time. And so here's a Roman government official who has the title clearly inscribed in his culture. And he so deeply defended that title, not only against one of his wives, but also several of his children, torturing and putting them to death in order that he might feel secure on his throne as king of the Jews. And when Herod heard this question was in town by the wise men, he asked them what brought them this way. They told him they had seen a star and it brought them this far. And surely the folks in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, surely they would know where this king was. You see, what caught Herod's ear was the fact, not that there was another professed king in town, but Herod was familiar with Old Testament Scripture. And he knew that the Jews were looking for a Messiah, a deliverer. And of course, that impugned upon his role as king of the Jews, but also against the Roman Empire. And so that was job security. So Herod called in the elite, those who knew such matters. And he asked of them, where? Where is he to be born? The wise men asked because they sought to worship him. Herod asked that question because he wanted to keep a check on him. He wanted to know where the child was. And he proves later what his intentions were for that child. The answer came back from the prophet Micah. And the answer was given verbatim by the scribes and Pharisees, that he was to be born in Bethlehem, 5 miles down the road. Just 5 miles down the road. And as the story is unveiled, Herod calls in the wise men on the side, on the sly, secretly, quietly. Having this information of Bethlehem I find it curious that such a dire threat to Herod and his position of authority would be met with a, "You go find him and then send me word so that I too can worship him." Not only was there apparently a lie involved here, but also he's saying this quietly. Why wouldn't that be a part of the fanfare among the scribes and the Pharisees? Why wouldn't this be news that the population would want to know? Herod wanted this information kept quiet, secluded. And so as he makes his mention of his intentions, the wise men leave, grateful no doubt for the information, and the star shows up again. And in that star, there is question among us readers. We wonder how the star appeared in the east. We wonder how it led them. We wonder how it brought them to Jerusalem but disappeared apparently. Or just was high enough that they knew it was over Jerusalem. But that star now becomes apparent to them as they are led down the road to the village of Bethlehem and literally to the very house. And they give thanks joyfully. They have found what they are looking for. There is in our reading this morning an apparent willingness on our part sometimes to be caught up in questions, and that's the purpose for our series here. To realize that it's our natural instinct to ask questions because inquiring minds want to know. And God is certainly willing to entertain our questions. Some of the questions that we might put to this portion of the storyline might include, why did Herod ask where he was and not who he was? Who is this guy? Who is the family? Just where? Perhaps it had to do with the fact that the wise men had been led thus far to a location without evidence of an identity, so maybe they couldn't answer that question. But the where was to be determined by following the star that apparently Herod could not see. Sometimes we've tried to explain away the star. We've tried to come up with a what if and could have beens. But sometimes those kinds of questions fall into the same category as those who find themselves caught up in questions about Jonah. How could he live in a fish's belly for days? Sometimes we wonder, how in the world did the Red Sea part? We ask questions and we appease ourselves with some kind of wild thought sometimes. But most of the time, those questions fall into a category that's easily described as a mentality for marginality. Looking at all the what ifs and the therefores instead of looking at the flow of God's relationship with His creation. Don't miss the main point by chasing all the rabbits. Stay on target. Stay focused. The question is, why were the wise men able to see a star that apparently others were oblivious to? Could have been that the star was there and it was visible, but they were looking for it. Perhaps that's why they were referred to as wise men. The idea that sometimes we also chase rabbits in our spiritual pursuit, failing to realize that while Jesus is King of the Jews, He's different than Herod. He's Messiah. And what makes Him Messiah is, the question the wise men were asking is, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? You see, nobody needed to remind Herod that he was there as a political favor. He was there because he represented Rome. He just happened to be overseeing a region that was largely encompassed by Jews. Hence his title, King of the Jews, which no doubt he was pretty proud of. We don't want to dwell on it. But keep in mind that same phrase is on the plaque that was nailed to the cross over the head of Jesus as he sacrificed himself for us. King of the Jews. But there's another aspect that these wise men bring to our attention. And that is that Jesus, this baby, is to be worshiped. Worshiped by all nations. Can you imagine a God so wise that before the foundation of the world, he knew that the fullness of time would not only include an arrogant king and a wandering people, a runaway religious system, but there would be a general population who had just basically grown weary of looking for this alleged Messiah. And so the star was sent to the wise men who had been looking for just such an event, who knew the history of the Jews. Remember, the Jews had been taken into exile where? Babylon, to the east. Remembering that along with the Jews came all of their religion, not intact in a tabernacle or a temple, but as a protocol through the wisest of the prophets, Daniel, as he served that King Nebuchadnezzar, and even the whole household became flavored with Jewish wisdom and anticipation and history and what they meant when they said they were God's people. And so now these wise men come from afar, following a star that brought them this far. And as you and I meditate on the background to these wise men, we ask ourselves of ourselves, is God worshiped? Is Jesus worshiped and accepted by all nations? Or is Christianity an American thing? Is that something we brought with us? And it's because we're a Christian nation, we are expected to worship Christ? Or I worship Christ because God pointed to Christ. He sent Christ into this world. He prophesied about Christ. He brought him in, protected and provided him as the Paschal Lamb to take away the sins of the world. Has nothing to do with America. Hope that doesn't surprise you. America does not fit into the gospel story at all. The story is for all of God's children, all creation, everyone who's ever breathed or will breathe. They are subjects to this King of the Jews, this Messiah, the one who was not put on a throne. He was born a king. And Herod wanted him on the radar for political reasons. All nations bow their knees, just as Isaiah prophesied in chapter 60. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. This everyone gospel is what Jesus made reference to. Here in this same Gospel of Matthew, it's recorded. He comes in as a king, and he goes out as a king. And all nations are the audience for this message. Have you noticed that there wasn't any shepherds in the manger scene in Matthew's Gospel? Matthew, which is a gospel written, most believe, primarily to Jewish readers, begins with the story of the wise men coming from afar. This is an international God thing. This is not a Jewish thing, never was. The Jews were a type for us to see God's people in a spiritual sense as the nation, the royal priesthood, the holy nation, a people for God's own possession. That's what the Jews were to represent in history, as you and I benefit now as children of God, His nation, His royal priesthood. And here we are at Isaiah's prophecy in its fulfillment, and the end of Matthew's gospel saying, all authority has been given to me. He's not just King of the Jews. He is the King of all God's people. We look to Him for our leadership, for our guidance, as well as for our salvation. There's something else about this story that is certainly worth noting, and that is that God wields the universe. He doesn't have a scepter. He has the universe, making His Son known and worshiped. We have a star with no natural explanation, try as we might. We have wise men from a foreign place, not among the Jewish people, who are looking for such a Messiah. And then we have folks who have a Bible on every coffee stand. Many of us probably have it on our phones. We have God's Word readily available like no other people have ever had. And how many are looking for the Messiah? Many who will say, I believe in God. Well, sure, Jesus was the Son of God, because that's what tradition has taught them, because that's what religion has taught them, because that's what they see others mimicking. But how many see Christ as the wise men saw Christ? As the long-awaited, promised, born King as Messiah. You and I find ourselves, hopefully, with stubbed toes, looking at the many ways in which God has put stars and seas and fish and moons into positions of declaring His glory as well as His intent. And how often they just pass us by. Because just like in Jerusalem, there weren't many folks looking for Messiah. We mentioned 2 weeks ago how Zacharias was somehow taken back, and he was a priest, a righteous priest. But now that God's going to actually do something that He hadn't done for centuries, it's kind of hard for us to get on board. Going into all the world and preaching the gospel, making believers through that gospel message. That's the way in which the Son, S-O-N, is worshiped. God uses His whole repertoire. John mentions in his gospel, chapter 4, verse 23, such the Father seeks to worship Him. Hearts that are kindled with a desire to worship. And that desire is universal. And our job is to take them the answer. The come and see mentality that was used among His own apostles. As they would bring their friends, I have found the Messiah. Come and see. The go and tell of Matthew chapter 28 is the message that leaves us an eternal job, a task to do without end, as God has set time in motion. Then there's the obvious thing that catches our attention because of the intrigue to it, and that is the evidence of Herod's intent. It says that he was troubled when he heard them asking the question. Just the fact that they came with their renown and met with a king to ask that same question, because they had been brought thus far, and surely there would be an answer here, right? Not so. It troubled Herod, and I suggest that we be aware that that same Messiah is troubling to everybody who does not desire to worship the King. And with that troubling, it brings opposition. Hence Herod's scheme, his later murder of babies under 2 years old. Opposition, the fleeing of the Christ child under God's directions to Egypt to preserve his life. The making of his upbringing way down the road in Nazareth for his childhood years. Spending most of his ministry in Canaan. Do we see a pattern here that God is close to Jerusalem but not in Jerusalem? Do we see that God and Jesus' ministry is most often down the road in Galilee, doing the biggest part of his earthly 3 years ministry? Why is that? Why wouldn't the Messiah come to Jerusalem? Because the only thing Jerusalem had to offer was money-changing tables. And Jesus made no short order of giving God's judgment on that setup. Could it be that in America, I can't forget 2 weeks ago, the surprise on the gentleman's face, several gentlemen and 2 of them out of the crowd, when I asked the question or made the statement flippantly, talking about other matters, and money came up, and nonprofit organizational structures and so forth. And I said, well, as a teenager, I realized that we would solve the biggest part of our tax problem if there was no such thing as nonprofit giving. What? That'd mess up our whole scheme, wouldn't it? Where we give so that we can deduct. If that's a part of our gospel message, don't think the world can't read that. Don't think that all the things that we amass under the cover, under the radar of the tax system, goes unnoticed by the world who's working by the sweat of their brow. Might be time that we come to terms with what these wise men very clearly represent as they come the distance and pay the price of what it means to worship. Always prepared for opposition. It didn't take a reminder, just an information. You need to go home another way because there's trouble on the horizon. They didn't have to know the details. Just don't go back to Herod. He has no good intent for the child. They follow the lead. You and I find ourselves sometimes surprised that the world opposes us. It might be the way in which we're saying the gospel message. Maybe it's not coming across as good news as we think it is. Maybe we need to, as the wise men, worship with bended knees and emptied treasures. And the last thing we look at from this storyline is that worshiping Jesus means joyfully giving authority and dignity to Christ with sacrificial giving. You see, the gold, frankincense, and myrrh have often led to the assumption there were 3 wise men. We really don't know how many wise men there were. Other than being plural, could have been 2 to 20 or more. We don't know. But those were the gifts they gave, and that seems to be the importance of the message. Because each of those gifts were from their treasures. There is, in this scene of the Magi, the ascribing of authority to Christ by calling him King of the Jews. There is also given to him dignity by the bending of the knees. There is related or recorded the fact that they were joyfully at peace when the star rested on the house and they knew where the Christ child had been born. And then finally, there is the definition of worship in these wise men by looking at their sacrificial giving. No small task. It means joyfully ascribing the authority and the dignity with sacrificial gifts. Things that tell God, not mine, but your will be done. Not my schedule, but your schedule. Not my wealth, but your wealth. These wise men gave from their own means, we assume. They were not hinted at as being conveyors from one kingdom to another. This was from their treasures. It says they opened up their treasures and gave to him these gifts. And in the bulletin, the front page of the bulletin, there's an article about what those gifts could represent in our spiritual lives as a reason for why those gifts are mentioned. Not only that they were given, but that they are mentioned and itemized. I suggest that in all of our dealings with God, and particularly through seasons like we are in, and with storylines like we have before us this morning, that you and I, as believers, maintain a spirit of asking questions, not because inquiring minds want to know, not because we want in some way God to prove or explain himself to us, but because we as grateful beings want a deepening effect of just how good our God is, how much he has done, how clearly he has laid out his relationship with us. It is no secret what God can do. What he's done for others, he'll do for you. That includes biblical characters. You and I can have the confidence that our walks of faith will bring us into his presence and give to us the assuredness that we too will be directed by God when danger is on the horizon. When it's best just to stop the conversation and move along. Approach each one not with the intent of converting someone, but of simply sharing the gospel, and let the gospel grow in the heart of believers. You and I have a challenge this morning in looking at this brief story. And the challenge is ours about how the wise men and their interrelation with the Jewish culture might reflect God's relationship with us as the modern day church, or called out, or Christians, or whatever label we want to put on ourselves. Is it because we are God's people seeking him that we ask questions? Or do our questions more often than not hold us back? Because we don't know the answers, and we're expecting some kind of certainty. We don't start the conversation. We don't invite the friend. We don't dig deeper. We don't dream bigger. We just do status quo. We do expectations. We do comfort zones. Where will faith take us? When we believe like the wise men, that we serve a God who is for all nations and is unending and is loving and is sacrificial to us. Would that we offer ourselves up as living sacrifices, Romans chapter 12. Day by day, God does not need our money or our idols. I should have said other idols to be more accurate. God cannot be bought. Old Testament verifies that. What He wants is worship. Worship for His Son, not because He's His Son, but because He's our Paschal Lamb. He is God's provision for our relationship back into heaven. This morning, if we can assist each other in any way, putting Christ on in baptism, a physical or spiritual help that we can offer, we hope that you feel comfortable as we stand and sing.